So I'm sure glad to see you here again tonight. And I want to welcome everybody to the August 2023 Bible and Beyond discussions. I am your host, Shirley Paulson, and our guest scholar this evening is Dr. Sarah Morice Brubaker. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Augustine, sex, and the 21st century repercussions. Of course, some people say that Augustine, so from the get-go, you can tell there are different ways of saying his name. You can say Augustine or Augustine. Anyway, there are different ways of thinking about this super important Christian thinker and leader from the past. Our goal for our Bible and Beyond discussion now is to think a bit more deeply about Augustine's attitudes about human sexuality. For people already acquainted with him, you probably know him as the cause of some extremely conservative views on sexual relations, which has arguably caused a lot of problems in the Christian world. So with all that, let me introduce Sarah to you. She has just recently left her tenured faculty position at Phillips Theological Seminary, and now she's beginning her new studies in law. But she's currently chair of the board of the West Star Institute, and her PhD is from the Theology University of Notre Dame, and her book is The Place of the Spirit, Toward a Trinitarian Theology of Location. All right, so before we start with questions, I'd like to remind you that we do rely on your ongoing financial support, whether it's from PayPal or a check or through Patreon. And just so you know, Patreon is the best way we can extend our sincere thanks to you, because I try to provide things for those of you who are really contributing a lot. So, for example, later in September, participants in the top 3 layers are invited to a Zoom party. But most important of all, everybody's support is at any level is really appreciated. So we'll get going. Sarah, welcome. So glad to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. I am so excited and so honored that you asked. Thank you.
Well, it's going to be fun. So we need to start right off here with, are you going to say it Augustine or Augustine?
So what I've heard is that it depends on whether you went to a Catholic or Protestant school. I don't know if that's true, but I did go to Notre Dame, and I tend to say Augustine, but Augustine is awesome.
That works. Okay, well then, in that case, I will probably say Augustine. You may say Augustine, and everybody knows who we're talking about. Okay.
And it's his feast day today, which we didn't plan, but
awesome.
At least in the Western Church. He's not a saint in the Eastern Church.
So we did plan this conversation a couple of months ago, but we did not think about this being his feast day.
No.
But all right, tell us, he gets a bum rap. Can you tell us what he's getting a bum rap for? What's the deal?
Sure. And I will say, I don't think it's entirely unfair. There's some things to criticize there, but often it can tend to shake out that progressives, for very good reasons, tend to lay a lot of blame at Augustine's feet. And I think he has a lot to answer for. Where I get concerned that maybe he's not getting a fair shake is when people ascribe to him the idea that he thought a bunch of things are bad, namely, human nature and sexuality, that he just thinks that they're just kind of bad, and usually it doesn't get much further than that. It's just kind of held up as a position that, we good progressives define ourselves against. So unlike Augustine, we don't think that human beings are bad, and we don't have this really negative view of sexuality. So that's where I think it takes the problematic parts of Augustine's thought and actually states them more emphatically than he himself did.
Right. So then maybe you should say then, why do we say that's a bum rap? Is because liberals tend to think one way? Is that?
Oh, well, Oh, that's a good question. I think it's because there's a history of interpretation of Augustine
Okay.
that does kind of lend itself to that interpretation, but it was undertaken, before there were progressives coming along and saying, we're not like that. There were interpreters of Augustine who absolutely were saying, yeah, what's great about Augustine is that he reminds us how terrible human beings are and how awful sexuality is. So I won't say that, our lot is to blame. I think it's a history of interpretation issue mainly.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, then maybe since we got the difference between the good and the bad here views of things, what does he really say about human sexuality? What's his point? What's he trying to say to us?
Yeah. Okay, so I think in thinking about how to answer this question, which I suggested as a question, and then I'm like, wow, that's a tough one to answer. Why did I pose that to myself? Let me just start with some of the things that he says that really sound, super problematic and bad to contemporary ears. Okay. So there's one part, and this isn't about sexuality, but it's related. There's one part in the Confessions where he says basically that the only reason we think of babies as being innocent is that they're too small to actually do us any damage.
Wow. Okay.
So not a very I won't let's say that his view of infancy isn't necessarily cheerful in that remark.
Yeah. Right.
There are places where, like many people that he was in dialogue with in the Latin church in his day, he said that it's, better to be celibate if you absolutely must be sexually active. I suppose there's ways to make it morally licit, but, it'd be better if you didn't have to. And in his own life, he had many lovers. He had a long-time partner with whom he had a son. And he, at one point, kind of puts her away, and she goes presumably to live cared for by a Christian community as a widow, because he thinks that his call to be baptized and then in very short order a priest and then in very short order a bishop, like he went from baptized to bishop in 10 years, requires that he not maintain that relationship. And in his Confessions, he writes in ways that make people think, he has a lot of guilt about this. He also, he has an understanding of sinfulness that doesn't equate it with sexuality or sexual pleasure or sexual reproduction, but he sees sexual desire and pleasure as one of the parts of humanity that, after the fall is especially vulnerable to being kind of caught up in what he envisions sin to be. And for Augustine, sin is a lot like, there's a story in the Confessions, and some of you will have heard it, but it's the pear tree story. He and his friends, they're boys, they're playing around, and there's a neighbor who has an orchard, and they decide to go steal some pears, and then there's no reason for them to have stolen the pears. The pears weren't ripe. They weren't even ready to eat yet. They weren't hungry, and they didn't have, any grievance against the orchard owner. They did it just because they kind of got this sort of the fancy struck them to do it, and they did it. And there's really, if you ask why, there's really no why. And so for Augustine, that's a very apt metaphor for how sin works. If it made sense, it would be rational, and therefore it would come from God, but it doesn't make sense. And so for Augustine, what does not making sense look like? Well, it looks like when we follow an impulse that has no reason, that hurts us, and we keep following it till it takes on almost this compulsive quality. So that's how he envisions sinfulness generally. Where sexuality comes into it is he sees that whole area of human life as being kind of, especially by virtue of what it is, especially able to be caught up in that compulsive self-serving logic where you think you want something, you seek after it, it's really not good for you, and the more you seek after it, the more you become habituated into seeking after it and become the kind of person who will seek after it. And so it's almost like it's this area of life where, because it is so, it can be so beautiful, that it's that our fallenness is all the more apt to be so dazzled by how beautiful it is that we kind of were like, I want that, I want that, I want that, and to lose sight of what it should be ordered to, and to kind of take on this compulsive quality. So it's not that he says that sexuality is bad, though what he does say about how it would have taken place without sin is a little bit joyless.
Yeah.
But he does say that it's kind of this one area of human life that's, kind of, we're especially vulnerable to getting tripped up and kind of tripping over our own feet because of the pleasure that it provides.
It's really helpful to see why it could be thought of as not good or bad, but there are issues involved that you have to think about. That's very, very helpful, Sarah. I like the
point. I think it's interesting.
I'm thinking as you were talking about this, you probably should help us also by giving us a little historical context for when Augustine appeared in the world, and and kind of give us a history. Where did he come from?
He is later than what you all have been looking at. And we were joking before the session started that one of my closest friends is a scholar, and we joke that we're such good friends because he knows stuff really well up to 200. And I only start knowing things beginning at 200. So I really appreciate that you're letting me come here, even though it's so much later than what you usually look at. So I wrote down the dates because I didn't want to forget. So he was born in the mid-4th century in North Africa. And his father, Patricius, was not, so he was settled, and he had kind of a provincial bureaucrat role, but he wasn't like a big deal. He wasn't from an important family. And his mother, Monica of St. Monica, was Christian, and his father was pagan. And they were from, their ethnicity was Berber. And Augustine actually, I think this is right, I'm not sure, I believe this is the case, that spoken Punic, I think it's the case that scholars today still know how late Punic was spoken, largely because Augustine still talks about it being still being spoken during the Donatist controversy, which he was involved in. So North African, and there are really interesting scholars today who talk about him being kind of a colonized subject. He was an African, he was a North African. He was from indigenous North African lineage. Depends on how far back you go and who the various waves of people groups that settled North Africa, but he was not, let's say, born in Rome and sent there to bring everyone in line. He was from North Africa, from Tagaste. Peter Brown, says that he would have, he just spins this beautiful image of like, he would have fallen asleep to Punic lullabies and heard the olive farmers, because that was the industry in the area, heard the olive farmers talking to each other about how the workday had been.
Okay.
So, and you probably know, since you know the stuff in the first few centuries, he was a Manichae for a while. We know also that he read the books of the Platonists from Book 7 of the Confessions. We don't know exactly which books of which Platonists, and so that's a fun little mystery to try and decipher. He also seems to have been familiar with Stoic thought. And then, he has this period of spiritual wandering. He has, as he tells it, a conversion story. Although, when you read the Confessions, it's important, I think, to see that we have Augustine, the storyteller, really constructing his own story in a particular way. Like, his story about how sin works takes place with a fruit tree. Interesting, and his story about coming to faith takes place in a garden. So I think he's, unless it was a fantastic coincidence and he just had the most theologically resonant life circumstances anywhere, I think he's like crafting a certain narrative. But we do know he had some kind of conversion experience, because he's baptized by Ambrose. He had been educated in rhetoric as a young, kind of upwardly mobile guy from the provinces who was trying to make a name for himself. So he had gone off to go get educated in rhetoric. So he's on a path to kind of be a mover and shaker. But when he's baptized, then he goes in this very different path. But he's still an ambitious guy. So as I said, in 10 years, he goes from catechumen to bishop. And part of why many people think he wrote the Confessions is to, in a sense, make a case and say, like, look, I didn't know that God was preparing me to be a bishop all this time, but looking back, I can see that God was. So it really wasn't just 10 years, folks. It was really from the beginning.
Yeah. So just to make sure that we know, the Confessions is his major book that you're talking about that he wrote.
Yes, yeah, he wrote that around 400, I think.
And so,
this is cool. So he dies during the Vandals moving across North Africa and laying waste to various cities. So he's in Carthage. He's a bishop. He's on his bed. The city's being basically starved out. He has his clerk, secretary, biographer, whatever you want to say, there. He's praying the penitential psalms, and he tells his assistant, just make sure the library is saved, and dies. And he dies thinking his side lost. And he ends up being the most influential theologian of the West. Yeah. Another interesting thing is he never managed to learn Greek. And so it's thanks to him that a lot of these terms in Greek get a different kind of resonance in the Latin church, so that we then have these mutual misunderstandings later when each side's Christological formulae don't quite line up, because they're using, persona means one thing in Latin and prosopon means something different in Greek, and they don't quite match. So yeah, he's such an interesting guy. And he overshared. I mean, he wrote arguably the first Western biography. So how can you, autobiography. So how can you not, at least find him interesting, even if you think he's wrong?
Right. Well, I think this is important for us to realize that he was so incredibly influential in the history of the Christian church, even Eastern and Western, just because he seems like he's the dividing point between antiquity and late antiquity, and just seems to be the central figure everywhere. So this is important to know him. So, would you say that he even got his ideas from the Bible, or did he invent them, or what's his relationship to the early world?
Oh gosh, he did a lot of biblical interpretation. He has a commentary on the literal interpretation of Genesis that I used to love to assign, because in it he considers questions that sometimes seminary students would think nobody had considered before. And he's like, yes, it is clear from the biblical text that there were days and nights before the sun and moon arrive on the scene in the creation account. Like, this is not, that was something that people in the ancient world also noticed. But I think, gosh, if I had to locate, he did biblical interpretation. I think, honestly, I think what haunted him the most, and this is what he brought to everything, including his reading of scripture. I'm really going out on a limb here because I might be wrong and I haven't seen anyone argue this.
Okay.
So I could be wrong. But it seems to me that he wants there to be a Christianity, which on the one hand, because he did float around a lot of philosophical and religious schools, he wants a Christianity that can give really good answers. He doesn't want one that's deficient compared to, say, Neoplatonism in terms of its ability to give answers. On the other hand, he doesn't want a religion where only very fancy, well-educated people who can back up all of their claims with the best arguments under the sun and know the proper terminology can be considered faithful. And that's for a few reasons. One is just where he comes from. He wasn't from a town where there were loads of educated people and he had to go off to go get educated. Monica for him serves as a real figure of like simple faithfulness that, to its credit, doesn't need to go get a bunch of fancy degrees in order to convince itself to, be faithful. And also, he seemed to have been so turned off by how very well-educated people could come up with really good arguments, even really good arguments about God, and the arguments would work, but their moral posture wouldn't work because they were so proud of how good their arguments were. So, he kind of feels like it should be true that if you make these really good arguments such that you come to a point of saying, oh, and this is how God is, you should then be humbled and become loving and love your neighbor and love God. But so many people, he watched them like get smarter and smarter and smarter, make better and better arguments, and just become jerks. And whatever they figured out about God, instead of it making them humble and kind, it would make them say, ooh, look at how clever I am. Now God is, as John Cavadini at Notre Dame put it, now God is an item on my resume. And that really bothered him. And you can see this in the Confessions as well. He shares stories about his own schooling where it was just bound up with violence and posturing. So if you got a wrong answer, you'd be beaten. Yeah. And if you got a right answer, it meant you won.
You won. So, we better talk about how does this relate to the 2023? Which I think is such an interesting point that you've made about this. So if his views of sexuality have problems in them, the way we think about it today, why do you think it is worth our while to talk about him now at this time? We take it seriously at this point.
So I think that because he says something much more sophisticated than just sex is bad, pleasure is bad, it's worth saying, okay, Augustine, you don't say sex is bad, pleasure is bad. What do you say? And in particular, the question I want to pose to him is let's give you a fair hearing. How would you say that sexuality would work if there was no sin? Now, I think there are problems with the result that I believe in this fictional conversation with him that he would say, but I think they're instructive ones. Like what he offers is something that seems so joyless by our standards, and it is in a way. But I think just noticing, like, somebody real smart found this appealing. So why? And is there anything about what he found appealing, even if we don't want to follow him where he goes, that could kind of just in its strangeness tell us a little bit more about the assumptions we're making that cause us to think it's so strange and unappealing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So tell us what would be appealing. I think you were getting at that at the beginning, but I want you to just flesh that out a little bit for us.
Okay, so according to Augustine, as I understand him, if humanity had never sinned, which of course sin doesn't have a reason in Augustine's thought, it's just if you say, why is there sin? The answer is no. Why? Because if you could answer why, it would be rational, and that would mean that it was from God, right? So if there had never been any sin, how would sexuality, how would sexual reproduction, sexual pleasure take place? And the way it would work is something like you would love someone, but you would love them as kind of a moment in your loving of God. And he does this with friendship too, not just with romantic love. You should only enjoy God, and you should use everything and everybody else for the sake of enjoying God. And so it's like, we don't want to think, oh, let's use each other. And he says you absolutely should use each other for the sake of only enjoying and loving God. Now, why would he say this? Two things. One is, I think he's very heartbroken and haunted. I mean, he's really, he finds it a real problem, the way that human beings actually do use each other when it involves exploitation, domination, subduing. And so when he's saying, if you love someone, you should use them, he doesn't mean use them to exploit them or to extract something from them that you enjoy. He wants something better for them than that, and better for you. And because of how he envisions human social life, the only way that he can kind of get there is to say your ultimate enjoyment shouldn't be in them. You should only use them to enjoy that source of joy, which will never be exhausted, whose limits you'll never run up against, who you'll never catch on a bad day, which is God. And so then where sexuality comes into it is the same thing. Like, you shouldn't, your sexual delight in your partner should be rational. So it shouldn't take on this compulsive quality. If, Augustine, and in some alternate history where he got married, Mrs. Augustine had decided to have sex, it would have been because they, thought about it rationally and decided that propagating the species might be a good idea right now. And they weighed the pros and cons, right? So it'd be a rational decision. It would have no kind of embodied, appetites driving you hither and yon, and your intellect's just trying to justify after the fact what it is that your appetites made you do. It would be intellectual first and foremost, would be pleasurable, but it wouldn't take on any kind of involuntary capacity. Interestingly, Augustine's actually really bothered throughout his theological writing by the fact that erections don't respond to rational control. Like, he writes about this a lot.
Oh,
He's
no.
like, why is it? There's times when you want it and it won't perform. And then there's times when you're like, please, no, I'm in front of the geometry class writing a problem on the board and my pants are pitching a tent. Sorry for being crass, but he's an earthy theologian. So he's really bothered by that. So what he would like is for it to be rational, for it to not have any compulsive quality whatsoever. You're not being led around by your appetites. And any enjoyment really doesn't ultimately refer to the partner, but refers to God, because God's goodness won't be exhausted. You won't run up against the outer limits of it.
Wow.
You can love God as much as you want, and it won't be too much. And you won't be like, oh, you overpromised God. I thought you'd be able to do this, but actually you leave the toilet seat up and you don't, you forget to pick up the milk, whatever. Mm. So God is the only fitting object of our love. So that's what he offers us.
That's really, really interesting. Because you really helped us to break down the black and white picture of this and think more nuanced and much more thoughtful. It's very, very helpful. So the way we kind of run our time together is, for the first half hour, I get to ask you all the questions, and now it's everybody else's turn. So
fast.
Isn't that fun? So you are still in the hot seat, but now you get everybody else to talk to. So
there's something I forgot to say. Can I say one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't make reference to the reading, but if you looked at that bit from City of God, like where he describes all this is his model of, like, he's not thinking about 2023, like, people changing their relationship status. What he's thinking of is Roman imperial sexuality. And so that description of the wedding night, where it's almost comical, but it's also horrifying. He's like, we have the groom, we have the bride, we have this god, we have Priapus with his giant member, and we have the goddess of penetration, who has to be a goddess, because if it was a god of penetration, then the groom would feel threatened. And then we have, the goddess of virginity, to make sure she's a virgin. And so it's basically this like grotesquely crowded wedding chamber with all these different Roman gods playing different roles in holding the bride down and making her not move, and convincing the gods that she was kidnapped. So she's like, they have to go through this little play acting like, oh no, consenting, and making sure that she's penetrated enough. And so it's awful. And yet it was just kind of accepted, being that's what you do on your wedding night. And so I think that when you consider the alternative he gives, it's helpful to think about, what did he see it as being an alternative to? Okay. And I don't know, I can see why he would be horrified and want something different.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that, Sarah. Thank you. And some of you may not know that we always put a text on the website that goes along with what we're talking about. So some of you may not know that and may not have read what Sarah posted there, but if you did read it, then you know what Sarah's talking about. Okay, so this is the time to raise your hand, and we'll do it. Since I can't see everybody, that it's better if you raise an electronic hand, and then I'll call on you in that order. But again, Peggy and Hillary are here to help me in case they see hands that I don't see. So while you're thinking about questions, I want to ask you one more to think about while the people are thinking about this. It sounds like you maybe find Augustine helpful, because his worst impulses are the opposite of the present day dominant culture's worst impulses. So are there any other examples of where Augustine's vices are almost offer some kind of corrective to our own?
Oh, wow. I think that he's mostly unrelenting in reminding people that it's possible to deceive oneself and to to justify, to come up with really convincing reasons that can convince other people and yourself that behavior that's really exploitative is actually, very, very good, very above board, and absolutely the thing that we should do. And I think maybe it's tricky because people are positioned differently. I think some people, need to be encouraged to believe that they're not always deceived. Some people, especially depending on race, gender, sexuality, class, ability, different subject positions can get told, oh, you can't believe anything that you come up with on your own. Look at you. Who are you? So I want to be careful here, but I think for other subject positions and just, in general, like in an age of social media where algorithms will keep feeding you whatever confirms your biases, it can be helpful to walk around thinking like, I might be engaged in practices of my own self-deception. And that's why, the people who take up Augustine now and are like, we should rescue Augustine, they're often theologically different than me. They're pretty further, they're more traditional, more, conservative theologically than I am. But I think there's a lot there that's good. I think there's a lot there that's good for a whole range of theologically thoughtful people acting in good faith. And one of them is just his horror at like, look at what we do to each other and look at how sure we are that we're doing the right thing. Yeah. Something has gone terribly wrong. If that doesn't speak to 2023, I don't know what does.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, so Toto has his hands up. So go ahead, Toto.
So I love this. And I do think this whole thing, I binged Augustine during COVID, papers and everything. So, and you've got a wide variety. But what I never knew from when I read him the first time was he really contradicted himself a lot.
Yes.
It seems. So like at one point he says, if you understand anything, it's not from God.
Yeah.
Yet he also says all truth and understanding is a result from God. So which one is it? And it kind of depends on, is it his book? Is it early on? Is it a sermon? Because I think he did, and especially more of his sermons or pastoral stuff, it was kinder, He was really worried about people being too prideful, even though he was against Pelagius, he also kind of, I think, sided with them as far as people act too elite. They're too proud, and they shouldn't be. So I also wonder, because I found the confessions kind of unnerving. Like, this reads like he just got a problem with sex and he doesn't know how to deal with it, and he feels really bad about it. So he's confessing it, right?
And you're like, TMI, dude, we don't need
it. Is way too much. But I wonder, was it his mom influenced him a lot too? And I know that they were separated because of adultery, the husband's adultery, his dad's adultery. But in a vision, she took him back.
Oh, that's right. I didn't remember that it was adultery. I remember that she had the vision to take him back.
And he was violent and everything. I mean, he was not a good guy, but she still loved him. And I wonder how much do you think, when he talks about marriage is good, not just for procreation, but it's okay if it's for fidelity. Mm-hmm. If they're burning in lust and you're married to them, then it's the right thing to have sex. And actually you're blessed for it. That's like sacramental.
Yeah. In ways, and I didn't actually think of this until you were talking, so thank you. But it's similar to the move he makes with infants. I mean, so I mentioned before that he's like, the only reason we think babies are so innocent is because they can't hurt us, they're too small. But then later in that passage, you know, he says, but of course we come to love them if they're ours, you know. And I think, yeah, it's similar. It's similar to romantic love. Like, no, this isn't virtuous. This isn't the highest purpose of humanity as such. You have these feelings of new love. They make you silly and stupid, but, you know, but in marriage, of course, you have like a long-term partnership. Of course, you end up loving each other. And he did. He had a long-term partnership, as well as I only just learned 3 years ago. At some point, he apparently, when he was a bishop and he was acting in this pastoral role, he had for a time custody. I mean, that's an anachronistic term, but he was the guardian for like a 11, 12, 13-year-old girl. So I think, well, I remember how I was at that age, and I probably gave lots of people a reason to have a robust doctrine of sin as well. Adolescent boy.
Very good. Toto, for the question and the comment. That's very helpful. I say, well, Maureen, what do you have on your mind?
Well, I come to this as a complete neophyte on Augustine. So this is my beginning learning.
Oh, I'm so excited to get to
I've narrowed it down to 3 questions that I'll throw out. If all the talk, I read chapter 9 that you had us read, and you tell me it's all about Roman gods, but he's supposedly a Christian who believes in one God. Mm-hmm. So why did many gods influence so much? That's one question. Then if it's with God and it's rational and compulsive or not compulsive, and that's all, where does the Holy Spirit come in? Where does the God who was named as love come in?
Oh, wait, I'm going to write these down because they're really good. Okay.
So I got them written down for you here.
Okay. So many gods, Holy Spirit, and then what's the third one?
Well, and then the other one is, okay, all my learning so far about pre-Jesus and the Jewish traditions that would often strangle a person's faith because and then you have Jesus coming in with his turning everything upside down or right side up, depending on how you're viewing it, and proclaiming God is love. And then this church that Augustine is this fast track bishop in is supposedly Jesus following. So why does it not sound like he even knew about Jesus? So there. Anyway.
Okay. Oh gosh, those are really good. Okay, so on the first question, the multiple gods, why was he was using that as a foil. So one thing like in a way, this grotesque comedic horror show of all of these gods with their weird little hang-ups crowded into the bedchamber, watching this Roman bride be subdued and making sure that she's penetrated so that it can be a legal marriage. This is like the perfect foil for what he wants to offer and be like, but Christians have this, because he wasn't the only one at the time who was embarrassed by the fact that the Roman pantheon was consisted of like not very savory characters, but he just sought to be so useful to say like, look at us, like our God. And he elsewhere says like, if you want to imagine what God is, think about a good friend, a good boat, not actually these things, but just think about a bunch of good things, subtract the things, you have goodness itself. Okay, you can imagine God as being goodness itself. Think of a bunch of true things, subtract the things, then you can have God who's truth itself. So it was this way of like setting the stage perfectly to be like, but our God doesn't have any of these weird little hang-ups. Which is why your question about the Holy Spirit is so right on. So we mentioned that Augustine isn't canonized in the Eastern Church, and there's a lot of reasons for that. and I won't say that it was because of his pneumatology or his theology of the Holy Spirit, but today, when there's conversations with Eastern Christians and Augustine comes up, what Eastern Christianity and Syriac Christianity tend to find lacking is they say that Augustine reduces the Holy Spirit to just the relationship between the Father and the Son, because Augustine really isn't going to have the same kind of idea that you see developed so much in the Eastern traditions of the Holy Spirit leading to progressive theosis or divinization of humanity. He's going to be too nervous about that. And also, he just couldn't read the Greek. So his pneumatology is, let's say, underdetermined about Jesus. So this is where I'm going to plead ignorance to everything before 200. No, that's too pat. I think that he wasn't walking around with an understanding of the historical Jesus like we have today. So when he's under imperial Christianity, and at a time when there are these, the ecumenical councils are happening to like work out which brand of Christianity is going to be imperially favored and which isn't. So he's just kind of solving different problems than historical Jesus stuff would solve, which makes, it sounds like, well, why doesn't his life's work go back to Jesus of Nazareth more? And wow. The only thing I can think of is that the problems that presented themselves didn't need for that to be the focus. But then, that's weird. I don't think he cooked that up, but that's weird. Okay. Those are great questions. Thank you.
Great questions. Some we can keep on pondering. Thank you for the questions and the thoughts about them. All right. So, Peggy, do you have something to tell us or ask us?
Karen has a question in the chat. And Karen, if you want to ask it yourself, just unmute. And then I want to remind people that don't do this often. If you want to raise your hand, click on reactions, and then you'll get a choice to raise your hand. So Karen asked, and why has original sin been associated with Augustine? I believe in original blessing. And she's got a little smiley face there.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Oh. My reading of Augustine, and if you come across a different reading by somebody who's, more famous, by all means, go with them. But I think Augustine's notion of sin really gets hashed out in the Pelagian controversy, where he's arguing against Pelagius. And there's a lot of things at stake there, and every theological dispute is a geopolitical reality, in addition to just kind of a bloodless, let's have these arguments warring against each other. And it's really interesting and worth looking into in its own right. Where original sin comes from is, I'm trying to think of whether I want to give the version that's kindest to Augustine or most critical. So I'll just go with what can be shared about. Augustine, in his arguing against the Pelagians, so this is the group of people that think human nature has not been so corrupted by human wrongdoing that it's impossible to do good by your own power. So that's the side he's arguing against. Augustine wants to say, maybe every fleeting moment you can do some good by your own power, but it's very difficult. You can't sustain it. And the more important thing is that when when human social life itself became corrupted, then the process of making more human subjects was itself implicated in the corruption. So the making of new people involves, for Augustine, an already corrupted process. Now, yes, it's true that he did have kind of some funny ideas about the mechanism of this, which changes over the course of his career. And I don't actually have that timeline well in mind. I apologize. But I think the more interesting thing, if we want to kind of read Augustine as somebody who has something to say to us today. I mean, Augustine was writing before a time that they even knew that ova existed. So he was like, the spirit of the offspring lives in the sperm, and then the womb is like the field that it's planted in, right? I mean, he was very much an ancient then. So he was imagining corruption being passed on using a very outdated, to say the least, notion of reproduction. So I think that's like, he's clearly wrong there. But where he's maybe got some life in him yet is in his idea that if human social life forms new humans in ways that instill pain, instill notions that you have to dominate others to get ahead, instill violence and say that it's good, then what can we do? Because as soon as you've been formed enough to think, in some ways the damage has been done. So he would be a really interesting, so like theories of narcissism and the development of the narcissistic personality, not in play in Augustine's day, right? They weren't talking about that well before the advent of modern psychology. But, it's a really haunting problem. If certain theories of the development of the narcissistic personality, as I understand them, it's not my field, if they're right, then the damage is done by the time the person is old enough to even think for themselves because of the damage of the attachment phase of infancy. And so that's, I think, a more interesting point of contact between what we know today and what Augustine offers. Like, what do we do if our systems for forming new human subjects in human social life, if those are shot through with cruelty? And so I think that a lot of the criticisms of original sin are well-founded. But I just think this one little piece of what he said might be an interesting one to bring into theories of personality development today, if you've made peculiar life choices and you find that sort of thing interesting like I do.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that, Toto, thank you for your comments. If you haven't read the chat, you might want to check out his chat.
There's so many interesting things going on in different places, and I'm talking too much because I'm trying to read all of them. You
don't need to read. I'm just telling everybody else that they can read. Just get in there. But I'm going to also move on to Helen, and then we have DJA iPad. I don't know who you are, but anyway, you can speak after Helen does, and we're going to try to wrap up in about 5 minutes. So, okay. Helen, go ahead and tell us what's on your mind.
I'm sorry, I'm looking at my main computer screen, so I'm off to the side here. Sorry. I have so many questions, but I'll just ask one or two at the most. One of the fascinating things about Augustine is he evolves so distinctly, and yet between the question in the chat, between the Manichaeism and Plato, and then his horrible experience as bishop with the dregs of humanity, so to speak, he has a very dark view, and so I just, Freud would have a picnic with this guy.
Yeah.
So with the wide range of views, with the evolution of his thinking and the different writings that he's put out, can't the church interpret him whatever way they want to, in the same way that people come up with very different views of Paul, for example? And then the second thing that I wanted to ask is that his bishop experience was really rough. He's living in a world that's falling apart. And all of this is followed by a period of a reflective time. I mean, he first has this reflective time on this very nice estate where he's reflecting about God and everything's la la la. And then he gets put down to earth. So he has this sense in this dark view that the church's role is to enforce obedience.
Yeah.
And it's just really impacted. The member or the Christian's role is to obey, and that the only thing that can save them is grace. And those are so fundamental to the Catholic theology. And I just wondered, as a Catholic, whether you think any of that's evolved from Augustine. So those are big questions, and I apologize.
Well, I'm sure that there are some roles somewhere where I'm listed as Catholic, but I don't attend anymore. No, I think you're absolutely right. And there's so much there. Okay, so I mean, when you were talking about like the dregs of humanity, there's some passage somewhere, and I can't remember which book it's in now for some reason, but he says, "Woe to you, woe, flood of human custom, will you never run dry?" And it's something to the effect of like, day after day, people line up with their children in tow at the city, this river of like refuse and raw sewage to throw their children in, and they pay admission to do so. And yeah, so saying that he has a pretty dark view of human nature is pretty right on, I think. And I think you're okay. So I'm sorry. The two prongs of your question, I just got really excited about what you were saying. So the first one was, why can't the church interpret however they want? And the second one was, remind me again. I'm sorry.
Well, just the idea of that dark view. Yes. Creating a function or role of church that's more the enforcer.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, and in fact, so it's hard for me not to geek out a whole lot right now, because I think you're exactly right that the dark view of human nature absolutely translates into, and that's precisely why you should obey without question, even if it seems wrong to you, because you're human.
You have nothing within you that can actually generate.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's horrible. And he especially, so he really hates the goddess Fortuna or Tuche of fortune or luck. He thinks that's awful. Why would you worship anything that had to do with leaving things to chance? And what he wants to offer in its place is divine providence. The problem is that the way he gets there says you should basically just like anything. If you were to run headlong into a fire, you could do that in a overly reckless, rash way. If you were to run headlong into battle, even if you were full of bravery, you could do that in a reckless, headstrong, rash way. There's all these sort of things where if you run ahead, even if it's for a good reason, but you do it recklessly, it could go badly for you. But he comes out exactly because of what you're saying, to say that there's no way you can be reckless in accepting and obeying what the church teaches.
Yeah.
Because that will never, if you're reckless running into the building, if you're reckless running into battle, if you're reckless going on vacation, if you're reckless leaving your tenured job and going into law school at 46, like all of those could work out badly for you because of chance. But if you recklessly, without thinking through your reasons, without making sure you have good arguments, but just charge ahead towards the truth of the church, it will never steer you wrong. And I just think that if that could ever have been held, it's not a credible belief anymore, in my opinion.
The institutionalization of grace.
Yeah, and it really does. And the way it plays out in the West, I mean, it is exactly that. Grace functions like Tom O'Mara at Notre Dame would say, it worked like the electric company. You do this, the lights come on. Mm-hmm. You know, you do the pilgrimage, the grace comes on.
Wow, thank
you.
Pay
your bill, you get to stay keep having the lights come on, right?
Oh, thank you. That was a fascinating question, Helen. Thank you so much.
I talked too long. Sorry.
So,
I love it.
Diane, why don't we have one quick question? If you can say it succinctly, let's see if what we can do with yours.
Okay. From what I recall, I think this is the period when Jerome is doing his translations from the Bible into Latin, and so therefore this is when the Gospels finally get to be in a language that somebody like Augustine could be reading. Up until now, it's been in Greek or Syriac or something like that. That's my main question. And the other thing is, it might explain why there's no loving father in his theology.
Oh. Well, now I'm thinking about Patricius, but you're so right. And that, I think it's connection until you said this just now, but it helps explain as well, like, why he's so irritated that little boys are getting taught Latin like he was by reading Cicero. You know, I mean, one could imagine him being like, look, we finally have some Latin works that would be edifying. And instead, we're reading these Latin works. I'm sorry, I got excited, but maybe you have more to say.
Anyway, that might explain why he was not familiar with the Gospels.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I love that.
Very interesting. Boy, you can tell, Sarah, we'd like to go on with you for about another hour or two.
Me too.
I know, this is just fascinating. Well, but we do need to kind of close it up, and maybe we can keep on talking on the early Christian text conversations Facebook pages where people can keep on talking.
Oh, cool. Okay.
And so you can add more comments and people can keep on asking questions. And so we can keep it going there. Also, people who are viewing this later can't ask any more questions, but you can do it later on the Facebook page. So, but for right now, we need to bid adieu to each other. And I will just say thank you to everybody for joining us tonight. This was the August 2023 textual study for the Bible and Beyond discussions titled Augustine, Sex, and the 21st Century Repercussions with guest scholar Dr. Sarah Morice Brubaker. Once a month from 8 to 9 Eastern Time on Monday nights, we provide a discussion on a topic related to early Christian texts. We ask one of our knowledgeable scholars to share their knowledge and insights, and we provide time for participants to ask questions and share their. So once again, I want to thank those of you who have been faithfully supporting these Bible and Beyond discussions, either through PayPal or checks or Patreon. If you'd like to join these supporters at Patreon, please go to patreon.com/BibleandBeyond, and you can choose any level of monthly support. Check out the various gifts that we're providing for each level, and we're grateful for everything that you're doing. Let me give you a little taste of what's to come next month. On Monday, September 25th, we're actually going to hear from another Sarah. This is Dr. Sarah Parks, who's going to help us understand how to find information about Jewish and Christian women in antiquity, since they're not very easy to find in the Bible. So that's it for next month. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight.